Right, so let's move on to panel 3, which is about the circular economy. So shifting the circular economy dial, what are the challenges and opportunities? Opportunities is a massive word that we need to spend a lot more time talking about here. How much can nature tolerate, and where do we start? What do we do? So I'd first of all like to ask the panel to introduce themselves. So My-Linh, please.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you very much. So my name's My-Linh, and I work at RBC Blue Bay. So that's the EMEA APAC brand for RBC Global Asset Management. So we focus, I'm sort of leading on the fixed income aspects of the Blue Bay investment platform, and I sort of help coordinate our ESG investment practices. And then why I'm on the panel, I guess, here is for the since sort of May 2021, I sort of helped sort of design and develop it and sort of help manage a sort of impact-aligned bond fund which invests in public markets in environmental and social solutions providers. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Michael Ray. I work at M&G in the impact team on the public equity side. I manage the M&G Climate Solutions Fund, and I also help the rest of the team invest in environmental companies. And I also spend a bit of my time working on the private asset side of the business, where we fund very early stage, innovative, clean tech companies.
Gabriel? And I'm Gabriel Micheli.
Yep. Can you please wave if you can't hear? Sorry.
Can you? I think that's better. So I'm Gabriel Micheli. I work at Pictet Asset Management, based in Geneva, in Switzerland. I have been there for 18 years, only working on long-only environmental thematic strategies. So I started with a clean energy fund, renewable energy, then a sustainable timber fund. Then we created a strategy investing broadly in the environment with the help of a framework based on the planetary boundaries. That was about 9 years ago. And now I just launched a new strategy called Regeneration, about regenerating the planet, restoring biodiversity. And circular economy is a big part of that.
Thank you. And maybe, Michael, can I ask you to start, please, by just defining circular economy? Because I think we probably all know what it is. But let's draw out the fact that actually we have kind of got slight differences in opinion sometimes. Please.
Yeah, sure. So I think if we just take it back to first principles. Thanks. Well, so if we use OECD data, so the world's humankind consumes about 90 gigatons of stuff every year. So that's like timber, agricultural products, food. Fuel is in there as well, so that includes oil and coal and so on, and also metals and materials. But the kind of ability of the planet to regenerate those things, that stuff, is only about 50 gigatons per year. So just in the simplest possible terms, and I'm sure it's not a big surprise to anyone in this room, the current consumption patterns around the world are not sustainable. And if we use the same data from the OECD, there's a projection that consumption is going to double by 2060. So there's a growing gap between consumption and production of natural stuff. And obviously pollution impairs the Earth's ability to regenerate as well. So when we think about circular economy investments, businesses, it's really anything that's acting to narrow that consumption gap. And that's pretty broad. So it's, most people would think of plastic recycling, and that definitely features in our thinking, but also we invest in selected parts of the metals value chain, for example, things like pulp and paper, and we're invested in some really unglamorous areas as well, like a company called Brambles, which is the world's biggest manager of pallets for just carrying goods around the world. Now, in one line, one sentence, why is that circular? It's because if every FMCG company manages its own pallets, it's really inefficient. You've got to cut down more trees. The pallets are underutilized. Whereas if one business does it globally, as Brambles aim to do, it's much more efficient. It creates better outcomes for people and the planet.
My-Linh, maybe can I come on to you? And I think one of the things we wanted to touch on also was, and you've started to get there, but is it just about nature, or are we talking people too? Or?
Yeah, I thank you very much. So I think that the easiest way to think about it is it's in the name. It's about the economy in terms of economic activities and making sure how that sort of is the activities that occur in there and don't degrade the environment and sort of don't have a negative impact on people. So I think of it as healthy economy, healthy people, healthy planet. And it really is about sort of a mindset shift. It's about sort of not having a linear approach to how we produce and how we consume, and having a more sort of circular mindset in terms of actually you design away waste so that concept just becomes irrelevant, because actually what is currently a waste now becomes an input into another sort of activity. So it's really about sort of making sure that you actually keep value in the system, and nature actually teaches us that. Nature never wastes anything. Something that is sort of a byproduct of something else that seems to be a waste for one area is actually an input and a valuable commodity for something else. So yeah, and I think you sort of coming back to your bit is that I think we have a broad sort of understanding about that than if you think about economic activities. Nature is one component of that, and in terms of sort of natural materials, but obviously it could include man-made materials, and it's about processes, it's about energy, it's about labor, about doing things more efficiently and effectively. But at its core, it's about eliminating waste.
Brilliant, thank you. Gabriel?
On the definition, so I agree with everything that has been said. The way we define it ourselves is sometimes you have papers on circular economy. It's the flow of goods, so you have to narrow this flow. First, using as little as possible. You have to slow it. That would be to reuse it as much as possible. And obviously, you have to reuse as much as possible. And on top of that, you have to regenerate, which means if you have new energy into the system, it has to be renewable energy. Or if it's materials and goods, it has to come from a sustainable source. For example, forestry or something like this. So yeah, that's
good point. Reduce as well as reuse and refine, etc.
Yeah. So sometimes it's defined more about just the recycling part, but I think we kind of agree it's usually defined by Ellen MacArthur Foundation as quite broad and through the whole economy, and kind of a mindset that has to change.
And thank you for mentioning Ellen MacArthur. They had a speaker at one of our conferences about 4 or 5 years ago. One of the things you should look up on YouTube is Ellen MacArthur's talk about why she started doing what she does. It's phenomenal, just being out in a boat and realizing how finite those resources are and just deciding the planet's the same. It's a really, really good kind of 3-minute video, so very, very short. Can I just check then with everybody that's here, are there any questions on what actually a circular economy is? Because my view is it's really important, right? We're not, by and large, we're not trying to stop people from doing stuff, right? Because that's just going to get so much pushback, no one will buy it. Whereas if you say, actually, we're still going to use stuff, we're just going to use it better and more sensibly. Are there any questions kind of on that for the panel? Because there are some people here who really know what they're talking about, right? So if you've got questions on what constitutes circular economy, please, now would be a good time to just, get any of those out if you wish, because some of this stuff does get quite heavy. One way from here. 2. So.
I got it first.
Please go ahead.
Oh, hi. With the circular economy, sometimes is there a greenwashing issue where people are recycling things, but actually it's less efficient to do whatever they're doing, but they're saying, but we're using recycled plastic, but actually the process to get that plastic to a stage that it can be reused is using more carbon than not doing that. How do you track this false economy?
I think that's an excellent question. And I was volunteering for Greenpeace a long time ago in Australia, and they were making exactly that point, saying do not recycle plastic. Nothing like energy efficient enough, but time's moved on. But please, would you like to take?
Yeah, so it's a very valid question, because ultimately you could say any company could say we are doing circular economy. Now every company is saying that they're doing something, they have some recycling programs, and how do you differentiate between the ones doing it, or is the company only doing that? Is it the process that makes sense? So for us, we have been trying to rate companies on the 9 boundaries, the planetary boundaries, for a while, and for that we use a life cycle analysis of a product, of what the company does. So we have an input-output methodology, big database that gives us different industries, what is the impact that it has, just the energy it uses, but the whole value chain, scope 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4. And I think we have to look at that whole picture for a company. So we don't really rate them on is it circular or not, or do they sales, but we rate them on that analysis, that whole life cycle analysis that gives us a score, which allows us to differentiate between the companies.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add anything? Or come on to the next question.
Yeah, just a couple. I think it's a fascinating question, and I think we're probably at the point now where we have to admit that plastic recycling has never really got off the ground. We're really good at collecting clear plastic bottles, so PET, polyethylene terephthalate, and we're quite good at cloudy milk bottles. But as you've alluded to, you're exactly right, they get downcycled. They end up in carpet fibers or bits of play areas. They're not actually like for like recycled. So we've sort of seen recycling technology Mark 1, but what we need now is Mark 2. And we can kind of see it coming through in the private space. So there's some really innovative pyrolysis businesses which take mixed plastic waste, doesn't have to be sorted, doesn't have to be cleaned, you don't have to take the lids off or the labels, you can just put it all in a reactor, and what you get out is essentially naphtha, and you can do whatever you want with that naphtha. You can make more petrochemicals of any type. Now, you've hit the nail on the head. That is incredibly energy intensive, but it can be supplied by renewables. So it's simply power and heat. So if we think forward a decade, when there's sufficient renewables and there's enough policy in place, we think that's going to be a meaningful source of future plastic, because we don't see plastic demand going away anytime soon.
Sorry, I was just going to add to this point here is that I think when you're at the stage when you're looking to recycle, that's actually, you've degraded the value quite a bit already. So I think the circular economy encourages you to think actually further upstream in terms of thinking actually, did the plastic need to be generated in the first place? Is that something better or preferable? So I think of it in terms of for circular economy, for me, I think there are existing industries, what you're trying to do with them is make them better in terms of reducing their footprint. And if you can't make them better, then actually some may need to be stopped. But then what's the other part coming across is then the new industries. Those are the ones that are best. So I think of it in my head as better is when you're trying to have an environmentally preferable product, but then actually there are some new industries coming through and they are totally about the transformational. So I think what you're highlighting there is that incrementalism that you might need to do, because the reality is we can't make that shift very quickly, but hopefully you've got another track coming through which is actually about that transformational, and then that is best. So I think it's those two. But we had that challenge actually. I'll give a practical example. Is plastics versus glass. So we invest in sort of glass bottles companies, and we thought LCA long and hard as well to think about it. Sort of glass bottles, they're infinitely recyclable, but they're really heavy. So if you're transporting them, they use up more fuel. So it's that sort of constantly thinking through, and we got comfortable because we were like actually at its core thinking about circular economy concepts. The raw material is renewable, so the potential for it. But yeah, I think this is actually the big elephant in the room with this here, is that I think we like to talk about a win-win situation, but there are going to be trade-offs, either between one environmental footprint versus another area of environmental footprint, or one environmental footprint versus a social footprint. So I think all we can do, and I think the other panels before were talking about what advice they'd give you, is I think you just have to look for the managers and the transparency about how they do that trade-off. And where that judgment comes in, because the reality is there are trade-offs. No matter what you do to try and decouple economic growth with environmental degradation, it's not going to be a perfect.
Thank you. Question here. We'll keep the answers maybe quick to this one. I'm just worried that...
Yeah, no, just a question with this. Sorry, a question with respect to the business model for the circular economy. So the idea of ownership and versus usage. So as an example, with cars, if a car is being owned, then the responsibility is on the owner, the consumer, to actually recycle it. And if it's if it's being leased, then it's actually with the company to recycle it, and they can also reuse the parts. It'd be just good to get your thoughts on that aspect of ownership and how that ties into the circular economy. Thanks.
I think a lot of people, if you've sort of did environmental sciences and economics, the poster child for that sort of concept is interface, in terms of the carpet. And I think you're totally right. It's actually about changing the mindset about what is it you offer? Is it a service or is it a product? And if it's a service, do you actually need to own it? To that sort of component. So I think and if you don't own it, it becomes a leasing model, then whoever is managing that, it encourages that ownership and accountability to conserve it as much as possible, to keep the value in the system for as long as possible, so that you can get as much out of it. So I think that there is a lot of that obviously happening, and I've seen sort of, you can't invest in it at the moment, but lots of very local sort of community initiatives trying to come up with this concept of, do you need to own a lawnmower? Can you all as a community share it or lease it out in some sort of way? So I think it is, but I guess the challenge is, can you come up with a commercially viable business model for that? But some companies have shown it's possible.
Would either of you like to come in?
Just maybe one very quick comment. So there is a real-time experiment on this being run in the EU right now, which is that at the national level, there's a new tax, which is €800 per tonne on any non-recyclable plastic waste, and they just can't figure out where it's going to sit in the industry. So it's currently paid through the balance of payments, but one day it's going to sit with the petrochemical company, or maybe the packaging compounder, or it could be the FMCG companies, Unilever and so on, or eventually it's going to be the consumer anyway. But the debate is completely open there. But at least they've set the headline tax, so there's some policy movement.
Thank you. Gabriel?
Yeah, well, for us, we'll always, depending on who owns it, actually, it's more about how efficient is it used. If it's rented, is it really worth it, or is it much more people using it? Is it reducing the amount of resources needed for that? So that's what we'll look at.
Thank you. Can we come on to risks and opportunities? Oh, sorry, was there a lady? Did someone else want to ask a question? Are we okay? I'll open for questions again shortly. Sorry, I keep moving the mic away. Can we come on to risks and opportunities? Just quickly give people an idea, in your views, some of the massive opportunity areas. Obviously, the risk is everything goes horrid, I guess, but maybe My-Linh, would you like to start?
I can do. I think it was touched on already by Gabriel in terms of obviously the circular economy, sort of the nature angle, the sort of finite resources coming into there. So that's where I guess the risks come in from that side. And we talked about, I think, I was very struck by the planetary boundaries as well. That sort of work that the Stockholm Resilience Institute has put together. I think when I saw it, it's like sort of in 2009, I think we had breached 3 of the 9 thresholds that are sort of around. And actually, as of this year, we've actually breached 6 of the 9. So this is how much of the shift is happening on here. And I think it was made a point earlier in the panel just before lunch, is this concept that why this is so important is that sort of multiplier effect and tipping points and the interconnectedness of sort of nature with climate change, with social issues, all of these things having this magnifying effect. So, but the last thing I'd say is that I think whether it's risks or opportunities, it's relative, isn't it? Because what is a risk for one is an opportunity for another.
Cool, thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I think the risk for me is when we look at the data, so things like energy consumption per capita and plastic consumption per capita, we kind of view them as like inexorably rising trends, and we're pretty worried that there's no way of kind of curtailing current consumption patterns. So as countries go through the middle income transition, they all want to use more plastic, they all want to have multiple vehicles and so on. So that's pretty frightening in many ways, but also just purely with my investor hat on, it means there's going to be some explosive growth industries, so they may be forced in the end by policy or just by behavior, but it means that there are going to be some enormous new businesses that haven't been conceived of today. So that's what gets me excited.
Can you give examples of growth areas today? Just pick up the opportunities a bit more?
I think so. I've already used one of my bullets on that, unfortunately. But so I think pyrolysis is phenomenally exciting because it's growing from zero. So there are businesses that you can invest in today which are involved in the collection of plastics or deposit return schemes or waste processing, but innovative recycling Mark II, technology 2.0, is brand new, and so things like that.
Yeah, so I think we're just at the start of all this. I think the issues are I think people here understand the issues very, very, very well. We know the circularity in the world of the material usage is about 7%. So if you think we're at 7% and we should be ideally at 100%, it's a lot of growth, or changes that should happen. And we see across most geographies that there are legislation in place for that. And I think the reasons, we know climate change, obviously a circular economy would reduce the impact on climate change enormously. But there is one even more, 90% of biodiversity loss comes from resource extraction. And that's really linked to the circular economy. So the two are very much together interlinked, and now there was a global agreement on biodiversity, so that's really something that will come. But there is a third one, is the dependence on raw materials. I think nobody wants to be dependent on other countries, and now it's something that's very acute. So that will stay, in people's preference for buying new products and in terms of regulation also. So we see really decades, of change there that are quite obvious.
Thank you. Let's touch a little bit on sort of differences, maybe geographically. You talked about different areas and resources and what have you, but also different asset types. Maybe My-Linh, you'd like to lead on this one as well, but obviously you're on the bond side. So would you like to touch on different asset type? Maybe someone else pick up on geography? Or
Yeah.
do a bit of both?
Cool, thank you. So I guess in terms of investable opportunities, I think there is an overlap. in terms of what's available to invest in equities versus fixed income. But there are some areas that are a bit more sort of unique to fixed income, so maybe I'll focus my bits on there. Is that I think with the fixed income in particular as well, is that there's two developments or two trends which I think are very unique for us to help with the circular economy transition. One of them is that we can invest in non-corporates, so we can invest in what's called SSAs, so sovereigns, supranationals, and sort of DFIs, sort of development agencies. And so what that does is opens up a whole new set of opportunities for you to actually invest and support other activities by other sort of issuer types that are actually very critical to the sustainability transition. So, for example, maybe I'll give you what we've invested in is the Rhino bond, which has been issued by the World Bank on that sort of side, and they are obviously very sort of dedicated to addressing and supporting sort of sustainable development activities in emerging economies. But with that bond issuance, we participated in that, and that supported them sort of putting money into that area, but in return, the coupon payment that we would have got for that bond actually goes towards conservation in Africa in terms of saving the rhinos. So that's a very innovative structure that you wouldn't necessarily get in equities. And then the second example is maybe the emergence of the labeled bond market. Is that is obviously a very unique way that you're able to direct through choosing an instrument that you're investing in, whether the use of proceeds can only go to certain projects, which could be more circular, or maybe you commit the issuer to addressing certain performance targets that are circular economy related. So I think they're two very unique opportunities and very exciting.
Thank you. Gabriel, would you like to pick up on the asset or geographic region differences, maybe?
Yeah, so I can talk about the fund or where we invest there.
Example, yeah.
In terms of assets, I mean, we're equity investors, so I think there are quite a lot of companies listed. Universe, we found around 600 companies that could pass the planetary boundaries and that have an impact on this. So it's quite a few. In terms of geographies, we have more exposure to North America for some reason. There are lots of innovation or new businesses.
Despite everything.
That we have. Yeah. In a sense, you have usually legislation, or we're much more advanced in Europe in terms of recycling. Lots of countries have a recycling ratio much higher, or a circularity that is much higher. But we tend to invest a bit more there. And the opportunities are along the whole value chain, about using less. You have energy efficiency, everything. We know there is so much energy that will be used for AI, for electric cars, that we need to change that quite dramatically. One sector that is quite interesting is all the software about conceiving. We want to conceive a new city that is not just net zero buildings, but all interlinked with the water, with the biodiversity, and kind of modeling, as you were saying, more what you would find in a natural system. And the circular economy is more about thinking a bit more like something you would have in nature. And today we're able to model that more and more with computing power. You can actually know what would be the impact. You conceive a product, a glass, where it comes from, what you should do, in which country, would it be recycled or not. So you have all this coming. And the fund we have, we call it regeneration, because we think with the circular economy we can get to some net zero. But obviously, then you have to, restore what we have lost. So I think with regenerative agriculture, which is really part of the circular economy too, you will start having businesses models that actually have a positive impact while producing value, and that really should be the goal. Will be to decouple value creation from resource use, and if possible, try to. Like in the forest, any process that happens, it actually creates more resilience, more biodiversity.
Thank you. Michael, I mean, that's obviously sounding like a big shift in direction of travel, but do you have anything else to add on where this is all heading?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just one example of how regions are perhaps more interlinked than you might expect, or certainly more so than I expected. So if we go back to the mid-2010s, it was very common to export unsorted waste to China, and it would essentially just be put in landfill. So that I think the assumption was it would be processed and some value would be extracted, but in reality it was put in landfill. And China had this kind of like dawning realization in 2017, because the world's biggest landfill site actually reached capacity 25 years early. So they had to close it down, and it provoked this national undertaking called Operation National Sword. and they banned unprocessed waste imports and completely transformed global waste flows. And that's really what led to the EU Single-Use Plastics Directive, and also the Basel Convention has labelled plastic waste as a hazardous substance. So, you probably look at some of these industries and think that they're very regionally confined, but the world is just so interlinked because of global trade flows. It's certainly something that surprised me over the past few years.
Question for Michael, I think, just on the back of that little anecdote, which is fascinating, about the China and the export of waste. Could any of the panel talk to how the fund management and investment industry might influence these type of outcomes?
Yeah, I think I haven't caught all the panels today, but the ones that I have listened to have talked a lot about engagement, and that's core to what we do. And I think increasingly, I work on a climate fund primarily, but we engage across the impact team on social issues, biodiversity issues, nature-related outcomes, diversity and inclusion, and so on. And so I think what we can help to do is bring best practice across our portfolio of companies, and where we see poor behavior or behavior that could be improved, we can work in dialogue with the companies. So that's certainly one aspect. I would also say quite a lot of these innovative clean technology companies are still asking for capital, so they're not established business models. So clearly there's a role for public markets to fund them through the period where they're pre-profit. We've got a few examples of that across the funds on the team I work on.
Gabriel, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I could give an example. We have one packaging company in the fund that we have had for a long time, and they have some solutions already today that can be recycled and everything. And we're wondering whether they actually lobby governments, and so that regulation will come in their favor on that. And the companies having the solution should actually do it, or should actually explain it, or be together to actually explain what is possible, so that the legislation can move.
Can I come into a slightly different angle, but sort of covering your engagement point is sort of maybe it highlights the uniqueness of fixed income as well, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to invest directly in sovereigns in terms of funding them. We've actually been involved in we co-chair a global collaborative investor initiative of equity and debt investors who are explicitly engaging with sovereigns on the producer side and consumer side. What I mean by that is that sort of countries like Brazil and Indonesia, that we're looking to make sure that it's not actually the waste side, it's actually the extraction of those materials, that you're responsible stewardship and minimization of deforestation. So we engage directly with those governments and related entities to get them to manage that appropriately. But then we've also been engaging with what we call consumer-based countries like Europe. So we engage with the European Parliament on the sort of deforestation bill that's come through in terms of supply chain, and sort of encourage them to push that through and make sure that the scope of that was fit for purpose. So I think that's another way to think about this, is that I think it's that sort of public policy engagement. You can have issuer level engagement, you absolutely need that, but I think it's marrying that together with the top down so that you can sort of bring things faster at the pace that's needed.
David, does that answer your question? You're good, okay. Any other questions? We've just got a few more minutes left on this session. Lady at the front here, please.
Thank you so much. I was really struck by your comment, Gabriel, that 90% of biodiversity loss is linked to resource extraction, when we all know that we need a massive explosion of resources to fuel our insatiable demand for energy and our careless use of it. And so many of the solutions that you've all mentioned actually require an uplift in terms of technology, which means yet more energy is required. How do you sort of square that in your own minds? It's a really difficult question.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. There are probably different ways to answer, but one would be, how do you extract those resources? What is your impact? You can have mines that will have a very huge impact. It's true, if we want electrification, the amount of raw materials that will be needed, copper, some rare earth, and everything will be quite enormous. So there are probably a way, to do it that has much less impact, and there are technologies for that, and improving efficiency and making sure, then it's okay. And depending on the countries where it's done, it's quite different. And most importantly, I think, is about changing this technology. We know electric cars have, some big impact today, but the electric cars in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years will be quite different. For example, cobalt can be removed completely from it. So this, should be worked on enormously, trying to find, to use products. That's also part of the circular economy, is about finding resources or using things that have actually much less impact, and always taking into account, when you see an electric car or anything that has maybe some positive impact on climate change, what is the total impact on biodiversity, for example, at the same time. And that's why I think we should link the two. If you take just CO2, as one metric, you could actually wreck a lot of things just by doing it. And keeping biodiversity always in mind, allows you to keep that in check and take that into account.
And this is all deeply imperfect, isn't it?
Can I just add, it's really important. I think it would be wrong if you left this panel thinking it's about technology, about innovation coming through, because that implies risky, it applies in the future. There's a huge part of this that's behavioural. We can actually refuse not to do some of these activities. So I think I just want to balance that up. That I think that's really important. A lot of if you have that mind shift, then it's about behavioural change on there. So I think I don't want to sort of let people leave. There are some, I think what we've illustrated, that there is a lot of opportunities and they're not risky. They're in well-established industries, sort of well-balanced sheet companies. There are some newer ones coming through, and that's about the new activities we need in the economy that are best.
Yeah, we're invested in some boring companies as well.
But it's true that using less would always have the biggest positive impact. The problem is, if you see the world on the different curves, everything, it doesn't look like we're going this way.
Right. Can I just ask if there's one final tip or comment that you'd like to pass on to everybody here before we close? I want to make it kind of one sentence, if any of you would like to say anything else. Gabriel, would you like to start? Or are we done?
Yeah, so what I would think is circular economy is extremely important, or that's something that should be part of that, and all those principles should be kind of ingrained in when every product is kind of conceived from the start, it should be taken into account, everything and the total footprint.
Yeah. Michael?
I'll go with a curveball, which is most of the labels on the packaging we use do not imply that it's recyclable. So if you want to spend 15 minutes on a Friday Googling what is and isn't recyclable, I think you'd be amazed. I was. Thanks.
I'll just leave you with sort of maybe some keywords to watch out for in future: nature-based solutions and nature-positive solutions.
Excellent point. And with that, I would like to ask everyone, please thank the panel. That was really interesting. Thank you.